Access Minnesota, issues that matter to you. Access Minnesota brings you the newsmakers and the stories that shape our everyday lives, with analysis from University of Minnesota faculty experts.
In 1848, delegates attending a convention in Seneca Falls, New York, drafted a set of grievances and resolutions that set the agenda for what was to become the women's rights movement. Throughout the latter half of the 19th century, the women's suffrage effort gained traction in the United States. But it wasn't until 1920 that American women finally won the right to vote with the passage of the 19th Amendment. Over the years, women have made significant gains in the workplace, education, the professions, and politics. But there is still a substantial gender gap in the U.S. that touches diverse elements of our society. This month on Access Minnesota, we take a critical look at areas where women still lag behind men. Later in the show, we'll talk with University of Minnesota Communication Studies professor Mary Vavris about the state of the women's movement today. We'll also look at a recent U of M study that reveals a significant gender gap in the Wikipedia community. But first, despite the high-profile campaigns of Hillary Clinton, Sarah Palin, and Michelle Bachmann, men still vastly outnumber women among our elected officials. A U of M political scientist discusses the gender divide in politics. Kathryn Pearson is an associate professor of political science at the University of Minnesota. Kathryn, welcome back to Access Minnesota.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
Currently in the U.S. Congress, women make up about 17% of both the House and Senate. In the House, we're talking 435 members, in the Senate, 100. What do these numbers mean? Are women slowly closing the gender gap in Congress, or do they remain grossly underrepresented?
Well, it depends on the perspective. If you compare women's numbers to the 1970s or even as recently as the early 1990s, there has been considerable growth. But 17%, that's pretty dramatic underrepresentation for women who comprise actually 51% of the population and even a slightly higher part of the voting eligible population in voters. So women really are underrepresented at every level of office. At the national level, here in Minnesota, women comprise about 31% of the state legislature, so women are continually underrepresented in government.
What are some of the factors behind the gender gap?
Well, the biggest factor is that not enough women run. So when women and men run, actually, they win at equal rates. So it's not that women are running and losing, it's that there just aren't enough women candidates. And there's been a lot of research on this as to why. And with the growth of women in the pipeline fields, such as education and politics and business and law, we should be seeing more women. But actually, research has looked at men and women with the same qualifications and found that the men are just more likely to see themselves as qualified when compared to women with the same qualifications. So it's pretty striking.
Do we see the gender gap more pronounced from one party to another?
Oh, absolutely. If you look at the numbers of women in each party, women are much better represented in the Democratic Party. And that's because more women run as Democrats. That's also true in the electorate. Women are more likely to vote as Democrats, but the gaps are even more pronounced at the elite level. And you wouldn't necessarily know this from the press surrounding the 2010 elections. And indeed, Republican women did run at the highest rate ever, but Democratic women still outnumber Republican women by more than 2 to 1.
How have voters traditionally viewed female candidates for office?
So there are several stereotypes that voters ascribe to women. Voters think that women are more caring. Voters think that women are more liberal. Voters also think that women aren't as good of leaders, aren't as assertive. And so some of these stereotypes are more harmful than others, but even with prominent women in politics, such as Hillary Clinton, such as Nancy Pelosi, such as Michelle Bachmann, these stereotypes persist even though they clearly don't apply to these women in many regards.
What sorts of gender biases do women encounter in the campaign and in the election process?
Well, media coverage. So systematic analysis of media coverage has shown that the media are much more fascinated by women's appearance, by women's clothing choices, by women's families. So issues that men don't really have to contend with, such as, who will take care of the children? Does anyone ever ask a male candidate with young children that? No. But that question, of course, is commonly asked of women candidates.
In 2008, Hillary Clinton and Sarah Palin were high-profile candidates. How did the media treat them?
Well, again, political science research, mass comm research really has shown that the media perpetuated many stereotypes, even when they didn't fit, and that the media really played into this stereotype that, women were not as strong of leaders, that women should be more concerned with their families. Sort of all of these issues really fed into the media coverage. And then one of the things that really went on was cable television. So we saw more examples of really just flat out discriminatory statements on cable TV than we did, say, in the more mainstream media. But we saw examples of commentators, now granted usually from the other party, but saying really disparaging things about women candidates.
1992 was dubbed the Year of the Woman after 5 women were elected to the U.S. Senate. Since women have gained slightly more power and influence in national politics over the past several decades, how has that changed the political system?
That's a great question. So 1992 was the Year of the Woman for so many reasons. Record numbers of women running and winning office in both the Senate, as you mentioned, also in the House, the number of women going from 29 to 48 in one election cycle. And so with that new wave of women, Congress really saw a change in its agenda, in that women's issues, or issues that disproportionately affect women, were really brought to the House and the Senate floor at rates much higher than they had been before. So, for example, legislation was passed about preventing and dealing with domestic violence, women's health legislation, both health research, health prevention. Congresswomen called for a GAO study as to why women weren't included in clinical trials at the National Institutes of Health. So that really changed. Women fought for more funding for breast cancer research, breast cancer treatment. So women really did make a difference in several important legislative issues that specifically pertain to women.
How does the number of women serving in elected office in the U.S. compare with other industrialized countries?
Oh, the U.S. does not look very good on that score. If you look at sort of measures of women's representation in the legislature nationally, we're somewhere in the 70s. I mean, that's pretty bad. But part of that can be explained by our system of government, where we elect members of Congress in single-member districts instead of on party lists in parliamentary systems. So several countries, for example, have requirements, whether it's the country that has a requirement or the party that has a requirement, that their list of candidates include 50% women, 40% women, depending on the country. And some countries even go far as to say that a woman has to be every other name on that list if they're going to take the top portion of that list. So other countries with proportional representation systems have easier ways of ensuring that women are elected, but even even the system of government notwithstanding, the U.S. does not rank very high.
What do you think can be done at the grassroots level in the U.S. to get women more involved in politics?
Well, one interesting set of studies in political science really points to the value of recruitment. So earlier I mentioned a study by Jennifer Lawless and Richard Fox that show that women are less likely to consider themselves qualified to run for office when compared to men with the same qualifications. And so recruitment is a key piece of this puzzle. The women who do run for office and who are elected often point to the value of recruitment. Someone else said, hey, you should really run for office. And so women's groups, both at the national level and in many states, really do a lot to encourage women to run for office by recruiting women, providing trainings, making up for some of these gender differences in society that may give men a boost otherwise.
Are you personally optimistic that we will see more women participating in the electoral process, running for office in the years ahead?
Well, certainly since I started looking at these issues, actually years ago, studying the 1992 elections in college for my senior thesis, there has been a lot of progress. But if you had asked, 21-year-old Kathryn Pearson in 2011, would women be at 17% of the national government or at a much higher rate, I would have said a much higher rate. And so I think, I am discouraged by the fact that this pipeline of women at every level of office hasn't produced more women at higher levels. Certainly, I don't know that I necessarily would have predicted that there would be a major Democratic Party contender for the presidential nomination and a Republican woman on the vice presidential ticket in 2008. But I would have thought that just the pipeline alone, the number of women running and winning for office at every level would have resulted in more women in the U.S. Congress by now. So I'm discouraged. I'm discouraged by the findings that women don't see women as qualified as men, even when they have the same qualifications. So, but on the other hand, I am encouraged by women's groups who do recruit, who do train, and who do encourage women to run at every level. But I think until the number of women in the state legislature increases and then feeds into the pipeline of women running for national office, I'm a little bit discouraged.
Kathryn Pearson, Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Minnesota. Thanks so much for joining us again on Access Minnesota.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
When Access Minnesota returns, a look at why women are having a hard time breaking into the Wikipedia community.
Access Minnesota will return after these messages.